to infect us. We good? Sound is good? Okay. Good. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our second yoga and trauma knowledge event. It's a really big pleasure to share this with you, and I'm super excited to have this amazing group up here take us through a really deep and powerful discussion. So before we get started, I'd love to introduce everyone. Let's start with Hunter, full name Dennis Hunter, who is the Vice President and founding board member of the Warrior Flow Foundation and a trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness facilitator and trainer. So welcome, Hunter.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then Nzinga. I would like to welcome Nzinga Oniwa-san, who is a holistic wellness consultant, a social entrepreneur, a teaching artist, and yoga teacher. So welcome. Yeah. And finally, let's welcome Anne Hurley, who's a trauma-informed psychotherapist, trained in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and trauma-sensitive yoga. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, and then there's also me. I'm Kino, and I'm the co-founder of Miami Life Center, the founder of OmStars, and author of a bunch of different books. And again, I'm really happy to be moderating this panel. So in order for us to get started, I would very much like us to understand the scope, the gravity, and the depth of the issue that we are discussing. So I've collected a few statistics that I think are really important for us to really just understand why a panel discussion on yoga and trauma, or trauma for that matter, is really relevant for each of us and so important. First of all, 70%, the vast majority of adults in the United States of America have reported that they have experienced some sort of traumatic event at least once in their lives. If you do the math, 70% of the United States is 224 million people. So this is, again, the vast majority of people in the United States have experienced some sort of trauma. And within that, we have the idea that, or we have the statistics that 61% of men, well, the majority of men, and 51% of women have also report exposure to at least one serious, life-changing traumatic event. So again, a vast majority of people. Between 10 and 30% of combat war veterans have official diagnoses of PTSD, whereas there are probably dramatically higher rates of undiagnosed PTSD in returning combat war veterans. Survivors of childhood trauma, including sexual trauma, physical trauma, and other types of trauma, are up to 5,000% more likely to attempt suicide, have eating disorders, and become drug addicts in their lives. Then, so we can understand the frequency and the gravity of this, because those are some big numbers. Here are some things that really put it into very personal and perhaps gut-wrenching clarity. Every 73 seconds in the United States of America, someone is assaulted. So this means that in the time that I've been talking, we probably have an additional 2, maybe 3 assaults that have been happening while we've been speaking right now, perhaps happening out on the streets right now. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. 1 out of every 6 women has been the victim of attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. Look how many women are present in this room right now. 1 out of every 6 of us has been a victim of rape or attempted rape. Perhaps even higher, because this is only reported instances. Every 2 minutes in the United States of America, a woman is raped. So again, during the time that I've been talking, think about the staggering reality of this. Millions of women in the United States, year after year, are faced with this traumatic, life-changing event. Men are not completely immune from this. 3% of American men, or 1 in 33 men, have experienced rape or attempted rape as well. Transgender population, including the transgender, genderqueer, and non-conforming gender individuals, have a dramatically higher instance of rape and attempted rape. Over 21% of the transgender community has reported rape or attempted rape. And again, that number is highly likely to be dramatically higher because we're only looking at documented incidences. And then in order to put this into perspective, when we look at trauma, I want to read to you a small quote from The Body Keeps Score, which is a really powerful book about trauma and how it's registered in the body. Nobody can treat a war or abuse, rape or molestation, or any other horrendous event for that matter. What has happened cannot be undone. But what can be dealt with are the imprints of trauma on body, mind, and soul. The crushing sensations in your chest that you may label as anxiety or depression, the fear of losing control, always being on alert for danger or rejection, the self-loathing, the nightmares and flashbacks, the fog that keeps you from staying on task and from fully engaging in what you're doing, being unable to open your heart fully to another human being. Trauma robs you of the feeling that you are in charge of yourself, what could be called self-leadership. The challenge of recovery is to reestablish ownership of your body and mind, of yourself. This means feeling free to know what you know, to feel what you feel, without becoming overwhelmed, enraged, ashamed, or collapsed. And this is what we're here to talk about tonight. So what I want to start off with is perhaps a relatively basic question, which is, what is trauma? We can look at the dictionary definition of trauma, but why don't we start with defining what is trauma? Nzinga, do you want to lead us off with a definition of trauma?
It's an event that impacts someone beyond that moment, and it can affect how they interact with themselves and the world and other people. That's how I define it.
And are there any other types like that we could categorize? Are there types of trauma when we look at it? Are there ways to differentiate that?
I feel like she's a lot better at this.
Okay,
because it's
so
her
let's
topic.
this is a panel discussion, so exactly for
I
that
can
reason.
go down the line, but you have the vocabulary a little bit better than me in terms of like clinical definition, and I want to make sure I don't.
Oh, probably not, but
stay in my lane.
okay. Probably not, but I'll let you pass. Trauma is, there's many different types of events. It can be a rape, it can be a murder, anything that you feel your life threatened or impacted. And we have different types of trauma. We have single event trauma, which could be a car accident, an earthquake, a hurt, many things like that. Then there is complex trauma, which is a traumatic events over and over and over again. That usually is seen in childhood trauma with, in abusive homes, where usually it's very complex. You're dealing with alcohol, drugs, abuse, domestic violence, and incest, usually in the home. And then we have developmental trauma, which is really a big thing that's out there too to talk about. And developmental trauma is something that happens to someone when they're young, and it's usually through neglect. And that's not intentional. And that's one of the things that's a struggle with working with developmental trauma. It's not the caregivers, it's not their intent, it's just lack of knowledge, understanding life circumstances. I think for me, one of the things I always share, and people hear me say it all the time, is, traumatic it doesn't have to be a huge event. It can be a small event. And I always say big T's, little T's. And that can be bullied in schools, and they build and they build and they build, and it becomes a big T, So it's not, so many people I think will not acknowledge or not give themselves the chance to say, I was hurt, or I did have that feeling. And because it didn't, what happened to you is so much more impacting, and it's not the truth. It comes out that way. And I think, Dennis, do you have anything? Sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking because you'd written a couple things. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I would just add that beyond the statistics that we can know about in terms of things that are reported, I think every single one of us is traumatized from birth.
Yeah.
Like the experience of being born into this world is a painful experience, physically, mentally, emotionally. We don't remember it because we weren't at a stage of our brain development where we could form memories, but it was painful. And when we emerged into this world, we had to take our first breath. And the force that it required to overcome the inertia of the lungs that had never been used before and to take that first breath is so painful. And it's the greatest forceful breath that you'll ever take in your life. And, you know, the classic image of the child coming out of the womb crying, there's a reason why the child's crying. It's in pain. And that's how we start this life. So we may not remember it that way, but every single one of us has been born into trauma. And trauma, as you were saying, it can be related to one incident, that particularly something that was severe that left an indelible imprint on us, but it can also be something that accumulates over time based on ongoing experiences and things that we're exposed to in our environment. It can be an individual experience, it can be a collective experience, it can be a racial experience, it can be a gender experience. So it's very complex to try to talk about trauma in a general way because it crosses all these intersections. And one person might be affected by trauma in several different ways.
So the fact that we're having this conversation so openly about trauma and different types of trauma is something that many of us might take for granted, right? But the diagnosis of PTSD was actually only officially recognized in the year 1980. So think of some of you who were born in the years before 1980 and think about these statistics hold true for the generations that came before us as well. And we take for granted now that we can talk about different types of trauma and that there are treatment modalities and that wound that each of us carries to varying and lesser degrees is worthy of being talked about and has a place in sort of the official, the official realms of psychology and medical science. To a large degree, we can thank the efforts of many psychologists and science that was studying the neurobiology of the brain in order to have some really clear benchmarks about what defines trauma. So I don't want to spend too much time bogging us down with neuroscience, but there are some pretty interesting things that I think are important that are verifiable with functional MRIs and that are universal in all trauma survivors. So the first thing that happens when someone experiences particularly either a recurring trauma or one major life-changing traumatic event is there's a deactivation of the area of the brain called Broca's area. For those of you unfamiliar with that, that's the speech center. So what happens to trauma survivors is that they often report something called speechless horror. And this has the unintended impact of depriving them of agency, where they're no longer able to describe how they feel. And if they can describe anything, they can describe the surroundings around them. They lose the ability to connect with themselves, their feelings, how their body feels in the moment. The second thing that's documented is a heightened state of arousal and a permanent state of a heightened state of arousal. And this is something that can be very clearly scanned and measured in brain scans. The last thing that I wanted to bring out with that is there's a deactivation of a very particular center in the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which neuroscientists call the watchtower. And this is the seat of mindfulness, the seat of self-awareness, and this, again, a very important seat of agency in relation to calming down that heightened state of arousal. And when that gets completely deactivated, the only thing that's left is the fight or flight response or the triggers of the nervous system. So here we are being able to talk about these things and measure them, whereas in the past, generations of the past were just at a loss. So one really important study, maybe you're familiar with it, that I wanted to bring on the table for discussion was the Harvard combat war veteran, the Harvard World War II study. Are you familiar with that one? So they were able, just by luck, to test this group of men who had enlisted in World War II prior to their entry into World War II, and then they tested their memories, I think every 10 or 20 years. And then what they found was that those individuals who had PTSD, when they were talking about their memory, they were able to recall vivid details of the moment and describe their surroundings. There was no change. It was exactly as though they were re-experiencing it every single time. the centers inside of their brains for time and space awareness, and this is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where you're able to say that happened in the past, are shut off. And so they relive it in the exact moment, and they have the exact precision of memory, but they can't tell a story about it. It's just fragments of memory. Whereas those individuals who did not report PTSD, they did something very interesting with their memory. 10 years later, all of the incidents were softer, and there was a cohesive story. 20 years later, it was even softer, and there was more of a cohesive story. So this is a marked difference in the way that trauma is registered, actually in the biology of the brain. So I was wondering if we could potentially speak about trauma in the nervous system. So can we dive into that a little bit about what, like, how that actually relates in terms of, you know, long-term stress, long-term storytelling, long-term emotionality. And Zinga, you had mentioned that in our discussion, so perhaps you want to start.
So I can definitely speak as someone who's experienced childhood trauma. And so one of the things that I had to discover and deal with as I was starting to approach healing from my trauma is that I realized that I had landmines, and I never knew when they would arrive.
Would you say what a
Landmines?
is?
So I'm going to describe landmines. So there's parts of my body that, if touched by a certain person in a certain way, would then onset create a flashback. And then, just like you mentioned in that particular study, it was like you took me back to the moment, and everything I was feeling in that moment would be happening in the present, as opposed to that was something that happened in the past. So one of the things I had to work with is, before, when I didn't have the tools with pranayama and other things that my therapist provided me with, I would be in it, I would be overwhelmed, I would be paralyzed, I just had to deal with it, and I couldn't talk, just going through the motions. And now with the tools that I have, I'm able to now calm myself down and recognize that I'm not in present danger, and be able to find myself back in a state of homeostasis. So a lot of times with the landmines, you don't know where they are, you don't know what will trigger them, and it's not always a touch. It might be a smell that's familiar, which was a challenge for me, because when I was confronted with it for the first time, it was someone who wanted to be in a relationship with me, and we're meeting for the first time, and they smelled just like someone who tried to attack me, and it was like, you know? And so that was a difficult one for me, because I didn't know that at the time that smell would trigger me in such a way. I always thought of it as touch. Even books might remind me of something. If I'm reading a book, it'll trigger me into a place like that. Like the book Color Purple didn't do well for me as well. So there's these connections that happen where memories aren't just embedded. Often when we think about memories, think of memories like, oh, they're here in our brain, but our body has memories as well. And that different things can then trigger those memories through contact, through different senses. Smell, taste, all of the above.
So it sounds like what you're talking about is the somaticization of memory and trauma, and that seems to be imprinted in a different way than normal memories.
Correct.
So Dennis, you had spoken about that in relation to the work that you do. So would you perhaps like to dig into that a bit?
I think, Kristen, tell me if my time frame is more or less accurate. Probably in the last 10 years, researchers have really begun to understand that traumatic experiences are stored in the body, and they live in the body.
Yeah, but Peter Levine and Basil van der Kolk for the last 20 years.
Especially, maybe 20 years. Before that, I think it was common to think of trauma as a mental experience. People who came back from World War I, they called it shell shock. But researchers now are beginning to understand that traumatic memory lives in the body, in the nervous system. It can even live in certain places within the body, like you were describing. So I just had a small experience of, grief over a relationship that didn't go right, and I stored it right here. And it was only when I did a 4-week practice of mindfulness of body, and I would try to avoid this solar plexus area every time I came near it with my awareness, that I realized that I was holding something there, and when I opened to it, I realized what it was about. I was able to process it, cry and cry and cry, you know, release the emotions, and I moved on.
Mhm.
But as you were saying, it's a traumatic experience or a series of traumatic experiences changes your nervous system. You're no longer the same nervous system as you were before. And to get a little more specific about the nervous system, you know, we have the central processing unit up here, which is the brain, and the kind of main spinal cord, which takes all the signals to and from the brain. But then you have everything that branches out from that, and it's all the peripheral nervous system that goes into every cell of our bodies almost. And there are several divisions of that, and not to get too technical about it, but you get down past the motor division and you get into what's called the autonomic nervous system. And there are two major branches of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And those of you who studied anatomy or gone through a yoga teacher training, you're very familiar with these two words. They're very important in talking about trauma, because what tends to be the case for most people who've experienced a trauma is that when a trigger comes, the sympathetic nervous system, which governs activation and hyperarousal and the fight or flight response or the freeze response, gets activated. And I guess you could say that the state of chronic stress that a lot of people live in our society is a chronic overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, which brings a whole cascade of biological responses in your body. Your heart rate increases, your breathing rate increases, your pupils dilate, stress hormones, norepinephrine, epinephrine, cortisol, adrenaline are released into your system in order to enable you to respond quickly, which was an evolutionary response that was necessary in our ancestors who, you know, faced lions and tigers and bears and saber-toothed animals, you know. But we carry that way of responding to things with us into modern society, where we're not necessarily facing things all the time that are a threat to our survival, but we respond to those things as if they were threats to our survival. So our sympathetic nervous system gets very easily triggered. Sometimes we live in a chronic state of hyperarousal of the sympathetic nervous system, and we find it very difficult to shift over and activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs the relaxation response, rest and digest, actually literally digesting your food. Like when the sympathetic nervous system gets triggered and you're in fight or flight mode, digestive activity shuts down. Certain other functions shut down in order to send all the energy to your limbs and to your lungs, so you can breathe more quickly and get blood flowing. And there's a whole other set of neurochemicals that are released into the body when we shift into the parasympathetic nervous system. So things like serotonin that are happy chemicals that make us feel comfortable and well. And I think that a large part of the relationship of yoga to treating trauma is in getting into the body again, feeling safe in the body, and starting to learn to recognize the things that tilt us towards overstimulation of the sympathetic part of the nervous system, and start to engage more with the parasympathetic and find a balance.
Absolutely.
Because it's not healthy to live too much in either one. If we live in too much in the sympathetic, then it's like a state of chronic stress and hyperarousal, like you were describing. But if we live too much in the parasympathetic, then we're just like, you know, sloth and torpor.
Yeah.
And so we need a balance. And
Absolutely.
I think it's a general statement about our society that we're out of balance, and that a lot of people are living in a state of chronically hyperactivated sympathetic nervous system, but it's particularly true with trauma survivors. And as you were describing your triggers, you know, we can be triggered in so many ways that we don't even expect. And this comes up a lot in the context of yoga and teaching yoga. that's another avenue that we can have in this discussion, but a practice like yoga that's a somatic practice, a body-oriented practice, body and mind, it gets us into the body, and that allows us to have the experience of getting in touch with the things that live in the body, things that we may not have been in touch with when we were just caught up in our minds, living our daily life. And if you're under the guidance of a skilled, trauma-informed yoga teacher who knows how to kind of, or a therapist, trauma-informed yoga therapist who knows how to guide you through that process in a way that feels safe, you can work with your trauma and process it. But in the context of yoga, trauma can also be accidentally triggered
Yeah.
a lot.
So Dennis, I think you've really shared a lot there, and that was really awesome. I'm going to interrupt you there because I want to go into a bit of what you've been saying.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that's really interesting about what you brought up is that, you know, the fact that we have this fight or flight response. This isn't like a bad thing. This is something that's set up to help us face potentially stressful and, you know, life-threatening situations on various levels. And one of the things that is potentially very interesting for our discussion is what is the impact that trauma has on that system. Because the normal like fight or flight response is there, you experience, oh, what's that? It gets activated. A non-traumatized person, they're going to go back into regulation. They're going to go back into mind and body or brain and heart coherence very, very quickly. But the traumatized person, their nervous system is going to be completely dysregulated, potentially moving into hyper or even hypo-arousal. So maybe, do you want to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts the nervous system?
Yeah, it goes back to what you were talking about with the brain. And you're working with the limbic system. Sorry. And what happens is the amygdala, which gets stimulated in hyperarousal, just starts putting out cortisol all the time. Unfortunately, with someone with PTSD, it never shuts off. And I like to give this example, and that's why I kind of brought his name up before, Peter Levine, is when a polar bear, say, has a cougar come at him to attack him, a polar bear will stay after the traumatic event and shake it and shake it.
Is that true for all mammals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they will shake it out, and that is the release of the trauma. But for us, we take the trauma and we freeze. And we freeze in the body. We also freeze in the brain. That's why I love neuroscience, actually, because when you get to the simple part, you realize that's why you're doing certain things. And it will then go on to affect someone, like you're asking about, like with war veterans. They live in a heightened startle response constantly because they've never come out of these startled states, And Peter Levine, that's what I was going to talk about. When he was hit by a car walking across the street, and everybody was the fire department, everybody immediately wanted to go get him up off the ground, move him, get him what we do, because that's what we're trained to do. No, he laid for an hour till the body, instead of holding it, let it go into the street. So one of the problems we have is that we carry this with us, and it affects us, and we live in a heightened, I always think of the parasympathetic system as rest and digest. That's how I've always remembered it, like from nursing school. I had to have all these little things, but they live in a heightened sympathetic nervous system. And so I think I'm following what you said, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah,
Okay. And so they live in that. So over long periods of time, it never really goes away. And you really know someone with trauma. I worked with the vets, and they will always have their backs against the wall, anything, a clap. I one time I did a lot of art therapy with them, and I'm not kidding, I spent like 2 weeks looking for hammers that would make this little sound. We were remaking their dog tags as a way to reform, and just that tapping, I had 2 underneath the table. So you don't even know the effect and impact that it has. But the part I like about the somatic part of yoga, and that my favorite part, is that even though we live in this heightened place, if we just pause, and we pause, that's where the healing comes, and people don't realize it. When that adrenaline is going, you are out the door. You want to keep going. I thank the nervous system for doing that, because individuals that have trauma like that would not be alive unless they had that response. I don't break it down. I honor it. I thank it. I work with it. But am I following? Was there anything else?
No, absolutely. I think that's a really important point for us to realize, that when we're speaking with people, that if that person has a trauma history, then they're in this heightened state of arousal. They're already activated in the fight or flight response. So just in terms of interacting,
Yeah.
It's a whole other level. And I feel like all yoga teachers and really teachers in general that are going to be interacting with people probably should be trauma informed.
Absolutely.
If 70% of adults in the United States have this trauma history, then anybody who's going to be leading a group needs to have some basic understanding of how to interact. And one of the things I think that's quite quite insightful is that when I was studying about emotions and trauma, I would talk to people and say, do you think you're traumatized? And there's so many people, no, I'm not traumatized. I do not have PTSD. I'm fine. I'm at peace with my past. I'm good. Peace, love, and happiness. I'm resolved with everything. Then there's a really interesting question, and I'd like everyone to just mentally answer this right now, okay? There's a train coming at you 60 miles an hour. How do you feel? Just answer that right now. There's a train coming at you 60 miles per hour right now. How do you feel? Take a moment. Did everybody answer? You don't need to share your answers, but by a show of hands, how many people's responses were, I would get out of the way? Classic textbook trauma response.
Mm-hmm.
How many people's responses were, I would feel scared? All right. This is the non-traumatized response. And what this is it shows, what this small question shows is the relationship between trauma and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And trauma survivors have often learned that their emotions are problematic and not useful, so they treat the emotions as problems. So when presented with the situation where a normal person would respond, non-traumatized, not normal person, but probably normal is traumatized now, but so a non-traumatized person would respond connected to their emotions. Well, I feel scared. I feel terrified. Whereas once you've experienced trauma, that simple test of the honest answer can really tell you, oh, maybe there is something inside of me, right? So what's this impact between trauma and emotions? I find it to be this weird paradox of decreasing emotionality, but at the same time, seriously increasing reactivity. So if you're disconnected to how you feel, but you're super reactive. So do you see this Nzinga, do you see this in any work that you do, or also with yourself? Can you recognize it with yourself?
I actually do a lot of work in the field with children who've been through a lot of trauma, because as a teaching artist, I do a lot of art therapy, dance therapy, and so I think part of the thing that I've seen for myself and the children that I work with is vulnerability feels like a weakness, and so then there's this perception that being emotional makes you weak, and so you have to put on this bravado of like, I'm strong to protect from a potential another scenario of harm. So a lot of my children who are actually very sad and still processing their trauma because it might still be going on, or they just came out of a very traumatic situation, will then be the bully. Will be the child who is super like mean and angry, and like you would never think, like for some teachers that child's emotionless, like they're just like and so then there's these moments where we have breakthroughs where I have them write poetry anonymously, or I say I'm the only person who will read it, and then you see a completely totally different student than you thought you were seeing in the classroom, where they talk about suicidal ideation and things of that nature. So that's what I've seen personally in the field, is that this false bravado is presented when in actuality there's a lot of fear, sadness, depression, and so on going on, but they can't show that because then they feel like that's their Achilles heel being present.
I mean, I think it's amazing work that you do, and I feel like this is something as in the yoga world that we can all learn from, because those personalities of those kids grow up to be adults, and then some of those adults may or may not find their way into the yoga room. So how can yoga and meditation help? So one of the things that I've understood about is that that when we use breathing techniques, when we use body awareness techniques, this is what you could call bottom-up regulation. So that you're regulating from the body and then communicating to the brain. And how does that work in terms of yoga helping?
I'm in the middle with that, right? Because there have been times that pranayama's been helpful, and other times that pranayama's been triggering. So I think I want to be careful with saying like it's the approach to take for everyone. I feel like there's no one size fits all, and we have to create a almost like a survey so that we can figure out what's going to work for the person that's in front of us. And so the challenge is outside of a space like a Mysore classroom, like in a traditional yoga space, that's not a place that those things can happen because you're not teaching to the individual, you're teaching to a group.
Right.
And you're assuming that what you're giving to the group is applicable to the group. So I'm
Makes sense.
so I feel like we have to change our approach and even how we teach in these group-led classes, because it doesn't account for the nuances that are present in the classroom, and the practice isn't always accessible for everyone, especially if they're coming in a room with trauma, and we're saying 70% of the room is coming in with the trauma, and oftentimes they're in denial.
Right.
So when these things show up, they might be dismissive of it, or they think it's part of the process and don't realize that this might be some suppressed trauma that's showing up for the first time in that room.
What sorts of changes would you recommend?
What sorts of changes? I think that we need to be more mindful of how we touch in the classroom. I've been in yoga studios where I've barely been in the classroom and the teacher's touching me. They're not asking permission to touch. I come from a studio that actually uses consent cards, so I think that's a great way to change things, is that giving me the voice that I might have lost because of my trauma, to say yes, I want to be touched, or no, I don't. I think consent forms are a great way to start. And it just, as a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, I put a survey up on my Instagram stories around it, and I had a consent card that I pictured, and I did a survey, and about 95% of people said yes, they saw the value of it. 5% said no, but then when I asked the second question, then they saw how it'd be beneficial to even themselves. But one of the people said, well, I don't want a consent card because I come to the room for an assist. Because she's more of a home practitioner. But again, I feel like Ashtanga is a little bit different than your traditional yoga classrooms. And a lot of times people just come in and they start touching you. They don't know if you're triggering. You don't even have a relationship with them like we create in these types of spaces in an Ashtanga practice. So I would say like a great entry point is a consent card.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
So I think one of the underlying issues is you alluded to it, which is the reality that yoga teachers are not sufficiently trained in trauma-informed awareness. So one of the things we do at the Warrior Flow Foundation, and there are a number of other organizations that do it as well, is offer trainings in trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness, so that yoga teachers can bring those skills not only into their general classes, like in a group class like you're describing, but also can maybe do community outreach work to a specifically traumatized population. So we work with the homeless at Camila's house and Lotus House. We work with police officers and first responders who experience trauma every day on the job. We work with, through a partner organization, we work with prisoners. I actually just driving here, I came from a state prison where I was teaching mindfulness to a group of inmates, and it's a very violent prison.
Yeah.
But
So what are some things that you recommend in the training? Some key points, and of course it's a deep training, and no key points would really go into the true power. But what are some key things, some updates to kind of the paradigm of teaching yoga that come from a trauma-informed perspective?
so first of all, it's about educating oneself as a teacher about the subject of trauma, and that often involves processing your own trauma, coming to terms with it. Because even in the course of these trainings, we find a lot of stuff coming up for each one of us. And then developing awareness of how to work skillfully with yoga and in a trauma context in order to help people who are carrying trauma process it and heal from it, but also to, as much as possible, avoid triggering it unnecessarily.
And how can we do that?
So in terms of assists and touching, our general approach, if we're going into a trauma population, like at Camille's house, let's say, our general approach is just don't touch. You don't know how much trauma this person has experienced. And until you develop a relationship with them and you understand where their consent boundaries are, you have no business touching them as a teacher.
Do you think that same standard should apply for regular yoga classes as well?
I do. I think that there's an over-reliance on adjustments and assists as teachers, and often new teachers go, full on into adjusting people. And I experienced some injuries myself from over-eager young yoga teachers who were out to prove themselves with their adjustments. And there's a more skillful way to teach yoga that doesn't rely so much on physical adjustments and touching people. It involves using words and verbal cues skillfully. It involves using visual cues skillfully. But we have to be, to develop a trauma-sensitive yoga experience, we have to be aware of all these things. The language you use, the music you play, the clothes you wear, the way you touch or don't touch your students, the way you set up the room. Like if it's a population of veterans, they often want to keep their shoes on and they want to be by the door because they might want to get out quickly. They've had that experience before and it's etched into their brain.
Would you give an example of some type of language updates that would be from a trauma-informed perspective that would be relevant to yoga and mindfulness classes?
Yeah, so this is a big topic of discussion that would probably take the rest of our time. But like when you're talking about the body or ways of moving the body, there are ways to be trauma sensitive in using your language that doesn't necessarily, it's more sensitive to the possibility of trauma being present and more sensitive to the wish to not trigger someone unnecessarily. So you might not say, and now in upward dog, raise your boobs towards the ceiling. You just wouldn't use that kind of language. If I told you some of the things that I've heard yoga teachers say, there's actually a list.
That's a new one.
There's actually a list.
No trauma, that's a beauty. Oh, wow.
There's actually a list of like the worst things that yoga teachers have ever said. You can find it online, and some of them are truly shocking.
I don't even know where to put that. I think my Broca's area is deactivated. So I think what could be useful for teachers again is to go through the process and educate themselves
so I think that,
as much as possible, because then it's an interesting space to navigate, because then once you become sensitive to something like that, you can second guess everything that you're saying. Yeah. And then say well, I don't want to say anything. Well, if I say this, that might trigger someone. If I say that, it might trigger someone. So then what can I? And then you can almost traumatize yourself or re-traumatize. Like if you yourself are a trauma survivor, you can take that so seriously and then end up in this almost paralysis of I don't know what to do at all because I want to do good, but I don't want to do harm and. So it's a very delicate space.
Learn to do your best and realize that you can't control the outcome. You can't avoid triggering everyone all the time.
I was thinking it's okay. So there's a really, I think, important piece too that could even be in a yoga class without having to go so far in, because I think trauma-sensitive yoga, you want to learn who you are. You want to get in, find out who you're working with, and if it's someone who can't be touched. But then when you move into the classroom where there are people who can be touched, a simple way without making it very obvious is not making it a command, like do your downward dog, or do that. You take the command away, you make it an invitation.
Do you want some help with that?
Yes, or if you'd like, why don't you go ahead and move into the posture that's most comfortable for you? Or how you move in this posture. And if someone feels stuck, you can just say, where are you noticing that you feel stuck? That way, because I wanted to say this before, and I have it. Usually when someone has trauma, the beauty of them is someone with trauma usually presents very well. They will have 1,000 eyes on their body watching you, and everybody in the room, but a lot of times they will present very well. And so it can easily be mistaken for someone who doesn't have trauma and can really do the posture. They might even go into the posture to the full expression because that's a way to avoid feeling the body through going through the posture. And then, but then they'll go home and they might not come back because they've gone home and they've fallen apart because all of a sudden there's been, too much. So I think even lately I've been working a lot with just breaking things down and just, inviting someone, asking them to notice their own body.
It sounds like it's the diction and syntax of encouraging someone else's agency.
That's exactly what you're doing. You brought it up in the beginning, the agency. And that's it. Empower them to empower themselves.
Right.
Because that's going to be the key. They're going to recreate the safety within themselves and the power. And that's why I like the somatic work with yoga more than just a somatic experiencing. You actually can rebuild your own foundation within your inner landscape.
Would you be able to unpack that a little bit for people that don't know what somatic experiencing is? And
So-
then also talk about what is the somatic expression in yoga?
Okay, so somatic experiencing is being able to feel your body, and someone who's really has profound trauma will not be able to, and that goes back to what you were talking about with the brain. They do not have body sensation. The rational brain and the emotional brain are not in balance, they're in discord. So they usually can't feel it, and you won't want to feel it because usually you've frozen. And if you start to unbundle that, we'll have what we call sometimes an abreaction. You will not even know what you're crying about, but your body is releasing. So when you work with somatic experiencing, it can be as much as you'll be talking. When I work with a client, I'm doing SE, we call it SE. I'll ask someone, we'll get into the emotion. They'll be like, I remember the car accident, we're going to, and I'll say, where do you notice that in your body? I want to bring it to the body because my belief system is you work top down, CBT, DBT, all that, and then you can maybe do expressive therapy, but you're going to have to truly touch into the body for the full wellness. And so where do you notice in the body? And then they'll say maybe my arm, and you'll ask them to breathe, and they'll say, well, it's moved, can you track it? And it's a very slow way to just, you don't need to know the story, it's just a slow way to whatever came up in the body to move it through the system, stop the paralysis. What I like about yoga is it's more accessible. A lot of people won't do SE, like especially when I worked with the vets, they'd be like, no way am I going to feel my body. I mean, I've got them like doing push-ups on the floor, being little like reptilian armor, and I'm like, they haven't felt anything in a long time. And so with yoga, you can ask someone to slow it down, stay in the pose, and they're not going to want to. That is going to be the biggest work, and that's the beauty of the breath. I'm not a big pranayama person with someone with trauma in the beginning. I want them to get into the posture. I want to learn to breathe into that posture, stay embodied. And embodiment would be staying in the body. We don't need to know why, but the fact that you did that, and they will feel the release. And lately I've been working with someone where I'm seeing where the body was trapped. I'm watching it go back subtly. And we're not talking about what happened. We're letting the somatics of yoga bring her back into balance with her body, letting her emotional and her rational brain reconnect. Because the story isn't going to help her. She's going to talk about that story, and then I won't be able to get her in the body. So that's the beauty.
It's very interesting. I was reading a study of post 9/11 victims, so people who survived 9/11, and the New York State gave a massive amount of money to fund psychotherapy for the survivors, and stunningly, to their surprise, they found that like 1% took up the money, then the funding to go receive psychotherapy. And anyhow, they polled them and said, well, what did you do to treat your PTSD? And they reported things like yoga, acupuncture, mindfulness training, art therapy, even tennis and running. It was basically anything other than talking about our problems. Right? And that's a really interesting point about the way how yoga can potentially be helpful. So if we want to create, as yoga teachers, as mindfulness teachers, a space where trauma survivors can feel safe to do the work of sort of re-experiencing their body, or as Buddhist teacher Tara Brach, she says that the unfelt body is related to the unlived life. So then as we begin to go and feel again, we do Trikonasana, and then suddenly we feel the hip. And then there's memories in there come up to the surface. What can we as yoga teachers do? And this is any of you can answer this. What can we as yoga teachers do to create that safe space?
Stay with them first.
Yeah.
Stay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you mean if someone starts to break down, they start crying?
I mean more along the lines of the kind of class that we set up.
Oh,
You
so
know.
I think trauma educating.
Mm-hmm.
Educating.
And what does the quality of that class looks like? Because we've talked about education,
Okay.
and I think it's an abstract idea.
Mhm,
So what I like, we walk into a class. What's the atmosphere of a class that's a safe space?
Well, you know, one of the first things I would tell right away is that the mats, there needs to be space with the mats.
Uh-huh.
We need to begin by talking about, I know, I mean, I feel like a broken record. I'm always like, do not step on their mats. Do not, because that is going to be the place that someone, especially with trauma, is going to say, okay, I'm going to become vulnerable, but that mat is my mat. And they will know if that toenail touches that edge of that mat. So being very conscious about that, yes. And how you walk in the room, where you move in the room. You know, if you know you're going to work with a lot of trauma survivors that really have, like, veterans, you know, well, the funny thing about veterans, though, the nice piece I love about this is Warrior One would be not something you would do with a veteran, with someone with PTSD, and they absolutely love it. You tell them Warrior One, and their backs will be to the door. They don't care about leaving, but because they're warriors, you know. So I love that piece of. But that led me. I heard this great webinar the other day. Is learning your clients, taking that time. He and I were just talking about this, like using the word intimacy is like, oh, we don't use that in trauma or not, but having that intimate relationship with your class, not just getting in there and playing music and saying do it this way, but taking that time to observe and watch yourself, you know, and set the room up safely.
Yeah.
That's something, Nzinga, that you mentioned as well, that there was a difference between someone that you'd never met before coming in and giving you an adjustment
Yeah.
versus someone that you built a long-term relationship with. That's a qualitative difference.
Yes. So like I know personally as a yoga teacher, even with my privates, my one-on-one sessions, I take my time before I even start to touch them, even though we're one-on-one, because I want to cultivate a relationship with them where they feel that I'm safe. And then I still, every time when I know it's time for me to possibly give them assist, ask permission, is it okay for me to touch you? And I never assume that just because they said yes last week, that I can just come into their personal space the following week and it's going to be okay. And so I think that's really important, because sometimes as teachers, as our students become familiar, we take that ask for granted and just assume that we can just come into their space and it's okay. And every day is different, just like we say in our dialogues, right? Like just be present, let go of the past. Don't think about the future, be in the now. But then we jump into their space and not take that into account. You know, that today is a different day and we need to make sure that it's okay for us to join them in that space.
And sometimes, particularly with victims of sexual trauma, sometimes there's a leftover wish to please the aggressor in order to feel safe. So they might say yes to an assist or adjustment that they really don't want, but they don't feel comfortable saying no. They don't feel comfortable setting boundaries. So it really comes down to using your own intuition and wisdom and being educated, as you said, about trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive yoga or meditation or whatever it might be. But there's no book of rules. You know?
So it sounds to me like that the teaching of many of our historical models of yoga and mindfulness have relied very strongly on one figurehead with a strong authority, and that authority was trusted and placed upon a high pedestal and not questioned. And what we're talking about is a dramatic update to the entire paradigm of what teaching and what even authority means. So this is something that's, I think, very much in process in the yoga community and perhaps the world right now. And one of the things that's very clear is that both yoga and mindfulness training and practice can be immensely healing. But what happens when trauma occurs in healing spaces? So what happens when the yoga teacher is the perpetrator and not only is touching, a landmine, but is actually, creating a landmine and is abusing their power? What then? What do we do then?
Leave.
Leave. So if only it were that easy, right? So this is the common thing. Of course, in looking in from the outside, oh, leave. But this is the same as you said before. You're a trauma survivor, and you have a pre-programmed in your mind to please authority, so you don't leave. In the same way that someone who's in an abusive relationship, looking from the outside, why don't you just leave him?
Right.
Why don't you just leave her? She's abusive to you.
Yeah, it's really difficult because I've seen this happen so many times, not only in the yoga world, but in the Buddhist world that I've been a part of. So many Buddhist teachers, so many yoga teachers have crossed those lines that you described and have violated the trust and the boundaries of their students and have actually committed sexual assault on their students.
Yeah.
I used to be affiliated with one particular Buddhist Sangha that now is going through absolute turmoil and falling apart financially, and people are leaving it left and right because the main figurehead, the one that's on the pedestal, was accused of sexual molestation of students. And it's heartbreaking to see what that does to the community, because people have so much invested in their practice and in the group, but then when the authority figure falls from the pedestal and they realize that he or she was a perpetrator, there's a great sense of loss, of grief that has to be processed, and a great sense of like, I don't know where to go next.
And disillusionment.
Yeah.
And not to mention the victims who have to work through their own trauma.
Yeah.
So I don't think I feel like this is one of the places where it's a grievous harm, because we enter into yoga and healing spaces in a vulnerable space. And what allows us to heal is being able to trust again. And then when the vehicle of healing turns into the vehicle of harm, I feel this is kind of like the ultimate betrayal. And there are two ways that I think that this could potentially play out, which is one, that we take those traumas and those mistakes made by authoritative figures of the past and let us inform to a potential new future. Or, unfortunately, what ends up happening is something that's often referred to as institutional betrayal, where the institutions that are there fail to, hold the victims in a space of healing, acknowledge the hurt that was done, and just carry on and perpetuate the status quo. This is, of course, not only in yoga, but also larger scale institutions.
I think part of the reason is because we don't have very clear rules and regulations in regards to that. We always have like this loose framework that might be on the waiver form, and I feel like there needs to be like a line of protocol like that is established for any yoga studio, or organization, so that when something happens, everyone who is a participant in that organization knows who to go to. But most people don't even know, well, who would I speak to if there's an incident? And so like there needs to be a line of protocols, rules and regulations, and then a conversation with everyone who comes into the spaces. These are our rules and regulations. If something should occur, this is who you speak to. And that needs to be told over and over again, so that when these things arise, they're not like, the person they're not even sure where to go.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you three know this about me, but I was actually raped by a yoga teacher. And it was a completely mind-boggling experience, because the way that it happened was presented to me as though I was being taught. And it was the teaching, and I was a difficult student. So if I could just receive this teaching, this would be the best thing for my spiritual awakening, because I was so blocked. And it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't blocked, that I was allowed to say no, and that this guy was dramatically stronger than I was, and I fought for as long as I could. And the thing that I carried the most guilt with was that I stopped fighting at some moment, because for two reasons. Physically, I wasn't able to, fight, but more than anything was that the mind aspect, like the mental aspect of the person in position of power, saying that I was a bad student, you need to submit, this is how you'll receive the teaching, I'm the true guru, and all of these things. And at some moment I was like, well, what if he is? And I am just this difficult student, like I am kind of stubborn. So then I believed that for many years. And then by the time I came to the conclusion, actually, this was rape. I said no, and I was violated. I remember going home, and taking like the longest, hottest shower and trying to scrub my skin. I just couldn't get it off. And to this day, there's some, and again, I have those landmines that come up in certain instances. But the reason I bring that up is I reported it to Yoga Alliance. And I got a standardized email that said, due to the volume of emails that we receive, we're not able to directly answer all of your concerns. And then they've recently undergone, a new, like I shared the story in relation to Me Too, and somebody contacted me from their organization, and then they said, unless you take him to court and he's convicted of a criminal charge of rape, unfortunately we're not able to do anything. So as far as I know, the guy's still listed.
Wow.
You're kidding.
Yeah, it's completely bonkers. And so one of the things I'm really interested in, the reason why I bring that up is not just to disparage, this institution, but to really say that what I believe needs to happen in the yoga world is that there needs to be a place, an organization that has accountability, alignment, and clear structures for victims in the yoga community to report. And I believe that it should work something like this, that there's, any teacher who's listed under said organization, whatever that organization may be one day in the future, should have a complaint form. That complaint form should be, be able to either be anonymous or with someone's name and be sent to a neutral panel of adjudication that would include, trauma experts, legal experts, and then they would be able to evaluate that and contact the victim and then potentially give the victim resources. Actually allocate some of the dues and fees that go into these gigantic organizations to then actually say, okay, you experienced this was a traumatic event. Here's X amount of dollars for, your therapy, whatever that therapy is that you choose, whether it's going back to a different yoga class or working through all of this. And here's money to potentially get legal counsel. Because many people, who experience trauma, they don't have the money to hire a lawyer and, train wreck their lives for 5 years to try to bring a legal case. But in case someone did, okay. And then finally to adjudicate that claim and then remove the teacher. I think it's not that unreasonable.
Iyengar just did that. Have you heard? They put a recent letter out.
Great.
They had someone that was caught, and it's a big. I think it's someone's finally making headway, and they said they sent a letter out saying we had a group of people. We even investigated it. It's true. You're not to go to. Well, people continue to and just support it. So they just recently sent a letter out last month saying this is the last written information on this. It's over. If you send people to me to do anything, your names are being removed. We have accountability to our survivors. Please contact us if you need assistance.
Yeah.
Finally, someone's saying, come in. And I think
Great.
you're bringing up a really good point, because I think not only do we have to look at it as an institution and say, yes, this happened, what supports can we provide? But I think we have to also stay away from the black and white thinking that, okay, then that means I don't ever want to do that type of yoga again, or that person was all bad, I don't want that. I think we come in now and we say, okay, we're aware of this. Like, you're doing this, you're saying I'm aware of this, I want to bring this topic out there. How can we help work with the clients? So we don't lose the beauty of the lineage and what was good and the good people in it, and we find that middle road, but we don't forget who the survivors are and what's happened, and still allow them to have a voice. Like you telling this right now, I'm like, oh my God, I just want to go over to Yoga Alliance and rip them apart, And obviously a pitta, so it's like, it's like I want to get in there.
I think just channel that energy to create a new organization.
A new one, I don't like them anyway, it's kind of, I'm not supposed to say that, I just got registered with their 500, so I like them today, but it's so important, because that's what, anytime I've worked with someone who's a survivor, it's always about, because this is the family system. This is what you see when you have, sexual abuse. You see in the family system, and it isn't always about a cut-up, because we are imprinted with that too. We want our parent, we want our thing. So it's how do we recreate that safety? How do we work with it, and what do we do? And so I love that you're touching on this, that there needs to be something.
Otherwise, how can victims trust once more?
And victims will want to close the door. There's going to be that phase too. It's going to come out, and I do want you never to speak to them again, because that's a natural thing. And so that's like that dance to work with helping them understand we are helping you, but we also have to allow others to still be present in yoga.
What you just spoke about makes me think of this work called the drama triangle, where we experience we're either victim. Then if we're a victim, we can identify a perpetrator, and then we look for a hero. So we're constantly and we can hold
And
each
go
of
back
those
and forth.
roles. And so when someone is a victim, they want to identify someone as the perpetrator and someone as a hero. As long as those roles are being played, that drama triangle can kind of really succeed. But that's not the framework of healing.
No,
That's the
because they're gonna
framework of
fail.
perpetuation. So if we're looking at creating systems that can support victims healing, we're looking at something that's not based on this victim perpetrator hero triangle. So we can't do this whole never talk about that again.
No.
Close, because then that's the perpetrator. We put that over there. Then people who speak in this way, they become heroes until they stop speaking in that way. Then they're perpetrators, and then that's or something that's kind of not really talked about very often is how victims can sometimes slip into that role of
It's
perpetrator,
the flip side.
which you mentioned with the bullied kids.
Yes.
And that's something that's not really talked about because, a friend of mine who she's worked with a lot of her own trauma, she says victimhood can be very powerful. So if we identify with that without using, the trauma and the intelligence to create the foundation of true healing, true growth, true evolution, then we just get caught in that cycle.
And I'll say a lot of times to someone who's caught in that cycle, I'll start to notice where they're failing in their behaviors and it's affecting their interpersonal. I'll be like, well, how's that working for you? And I'll always go back to talking about, I'll say, I hope we can move beyond that because we need them. They're going to be the ones we want to bring back with us to change this platform so that there is healing once they work on that. Because my personal belief is that I think people go in the triangle because they're afraid if they leave that triangle, it'll be forgotten.
Yeah.
So if we bring them back in and we make this a big part of it, that's why I say, I want to work with you so that you can come back in and help us. Bring meaning and purpose to this healing,
That makes a
and
lot
you
of
be the
sense.
foundation still.
So, if I could jump in, I think it's obviously so important to be having this conversation about the relationship of sexual trauma in yoga. But we also have to look at trauma in a broader context because it's not just about sexual trauma, it's also about generational trauma, it's about racial trauma, it's about just basic gender trauma, it's about the trauma of being gay or transgender or queer or whatever. All of these sort of intersections enter into the yoga studio and they're all at play.
So how do you see that intersectionality play out? That's actually where I was going to go exactly next after this conversation. So I'm really glad that you jumped in. So how does that play out? And what intersections do you think are most relevant to our understanding of trauma?
So obviously the sexual trauma is a big one. It's driven by the Me Too movement. It's at the forefront of conversation now, even at the level of the Yoga Alliance. But I think there are other aspects of trauma that aren't being talked about as much, like the basic generational trauma of a person of color in America, coming into a mostly white yoga studio, maybe taking classes from a white teacher who, it's on that white teacher to do the inner work on themselves, to be sensitive to the issues that a person of color might be bringing into the classroom. So doing the inner work of recognizing your own unconscious biases, recognizing your own implicit bias, recognizing, honoring the experiences that that person might be bringing into your classroom, it requires a lot of inner work. And the same goes for, issues of gender, issues of people on the gender spectrum. Like in one of the classes that I teach in prison, actually the one that I came from right before this, that particular prison has a lot of transgender people because the state has decided that's where they'll send them. And there's a very interesting and very tense dynamic among the inmates there, most of whom are cisgender men, but some of whom are not. Some of whom are in a process somewhere, some of whom are pretty close to being through that process of transition, and some of whom are in full makeup with hormones to give them female traits. And so coming into that context requires a tremendous amount of sensitivity to the intersectionality of all these issues, because the dynamic in that classroom is very complex, and I can only address so much of it as a facilitator. There's already so much that's going on between them in that prison that, you know, I don't even see, because it happens on the other side of the fence in the compound where they live. It doesn't enter into the classroom. So I think that, Zinga, I would like to hear your perspective more on this as a person of color about the intersectionality of race, racial justice, racial injustice with trauma, and how that enters into the world of yoga.
Sure. I'm in a lot of groups where a lot of this discussion is happening within the context of like people of color. And so a lot of times I find myself in a room just like this, where, is there anyone else? There's a couple people of color in here, right? Not necessarily of African descent, but there are some other people of color. And so I've been in groups where my other classmates would say, I feel seen, the teacher looks like me, you know? And I know that the students of color that come to me because they know they'll be seen and I can relate to them in a different way than a teacher who might not share the same common background as them and the same experiences, particularly living as a person of color in America. But then I can also, I know last class, last time we had this, I spoke to it as well, that even as a teacher, when I teach a class to a predominantly non-colored class, the expectation is I'm not the teacher, right? Until I announce myself. You know, if they didn't look at the schedule and they didn't look at the name, they assume I'm a teacher. They don't assume I'm a teacher, they assume I'm a student, because I'm not the norm in America as an instructor. And so then when I'm a teacher, there's oftentimes there's a pause, like, oh. You know? And so like in the conversations that are often had in the groups, there's this sense of I have to show up a little bit more and represent for my people, because there's an assumption that we might not be able to practice at the same level, and that might be valid or not valid. But so it's always like, I'm just giving you what this is the conversation that happens that you might not be aware of, right? So when I come into the classroom, I have to practice. I have to, even though I might not need to practice that way because that's not what my body is calling for, I feel like I have to be accountable for everybody who looks like me in this moment. So then I can't find the healing that I need to have in the practice because I have this in the background. And that's not just in the yoga room, right? This is in other spaces, but I'm just giving you this in the context of the yoga room, you know? So even as a yoga instructor, sometimes I'm like, okay, I have to show up, you know, I have to represent. But I've left that to the wayside a long time ago and just say like, I'm here, I'm present, and the students will honor me for who I am in all my totality, because I'm very complex. But then there's also a conversation of accessibility in terms of price points. But then I also teach yoga in Haiti, and the price points are still very high. Right. So it's not just an issue here in America, and the teachers look like the people in the country, but the price point is $20, $17 to $20 for a yoga class in a country where people's salary is $1.50 a day. You know, that's not accessible.
So would you, intersectionality is something that I think people might not be familiar with. So when we talk about intersectionality in trauma or intersectionality in yoga, like you would sit at the intersection of many different things.
Yes.
So would you maybe elaborate on that?
So I'm a collision of a lot of experiences. I'm a woman. I am a first generation Haitian, so I'm also an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and I was raised in a very strong immigrant household where the first language was not English. Then if I leave my parents' home, no one knows that I'm of Haitian descent. They say I'm Black, but then also I'm educated. So then that puts me in a different place as well. Just the fact that I'm in the wellness area is another intersection. So then when you put all these things and I'm vegan.
There you go.
And so I'm always, I find myself in these worlds where I don't find me, like someone like myself, because I am a cross section of all of those experiences that I'm living every day. And so people of color are often challenged when they come in certain spaces to feel like they can be their authentic selves. And so there's always a conversation about code switching. So, and code switching, I think, is something that everyone does, but it's more of a conversation for people of color where they're this is the person that they are when they're at work.
Yeah.
Right.
This is the person that they are when they are with their family. This is who they are when they're in a relationship. So we all code switch, right? The thing with particularly with people of color is code switching was a tool of survival that has now been passed down.
Yeah.
And so they don't always feel like they can be their authentic selves because they're taught not to be their authentic selves. Because
Yeah, and then how does that relate with trauma, right? Because as Anne, as you said at the beginning, trauma doesn't have to be, like a one incident, car accident,
So,
rape, something
I
like
was
that.
about to go there. So
Yeah.
then there's this conversation of transgenerational post-traumatic trauma. And so when you look at the research in terms of neuroscience, and just science in general, they're showing that trauma changes our DNA. So it's not like this experience that I'm having right now is mine. The trauma that I've experienced, if I'm blessed to have children, particularly as a woman who has eggs, one of the ahas I had is I experienced all of my grandmother's trauma before I even came into this world. Because there are parts of me that already existed in my grandmother. So when we start to look at transgenerational trauma, our DNA is being changed. And so then the way our bodies are experiencing the world is different than, let's say, my great-great-grandmother, because of whatever trauma she experienced has now led to us processing things differently, And so maybe when we look at data, because these are things that I'm starting to look at myself in terms of research, high blood pressure runs, we tend to have higher blood pressure values compared to other groups. But is that because of our diet, or is it because we're in a constant state of fight or flight?
Yeah. So absolutely. So they say that there's, in terms of what you're speaking about, is also this concept of epigenetics.
Correct.
So that as you go in, to different sorts of states, you can upregulate or downregulate a gene. And then, if, generationally, 3-4 generations have constantly upregulated stress hormones, and that's getting passed on. Then, however, there's something else in the traumatic response I wanted to dive into with you. When you're in those intersections, are those just constant microaggressions, micro-traumas that you experience? Different situations where you meet privilege or ignorance in different circumstances?
Yes and no. I mean, even, I'm going to take the color out of it because I am Haitian American. I'm not Haitian enough for my Haitian counterparts, and I'm not American enough for my American counterparts. So I always say I sit on the hyphen,
Right.
Because when I have a co-working space in Haiti, so I'm in Haiti a lot, doing a lot of this wellness work. But I speak Creole, but I speak it with an accent. So imagine when I speak Creole to you, you probably think, oh, she sounds like a Haitian. But to a Haitian, I sound like somebody from Britain, speaking English, And so it's oh, you're not Haitian, you're American. I'm definitely not American to an American. So I have to always validate my Haitianness. Even within the people who are in our co-working space, I'll tell a story and they're oh yeah, you're Haitian if you experienced that in your childhood. And it's I told you. But at the same breath, I know that there's experiences that I've had because of my privilege to have been raised here in America that my Haitian cousins or siblings. I have siblings who were born and raised in Haiti. They can't relate to it. And so there's this constant like, oh, you're not American enough, or you're not Haitian enough. And I think that those are some of the things, a lot of things that are nuanced for people of color, not just of African descent, just in general, immigrants, first generation immigrants in particular, because the family foundation is really strong in the country that they've moved from to come to here. And so it's challenging to be that person, because then there's always like, oh, you're Haitian. I have a Haitian friend. You know, like, so? Like, I'm a person, like, get to know me in this real moment. Don't, like, and I think part of it is we don't also know how to socialize like we used to. So we're always trying to find these connecting points. So when we find out these little tidbits that are my intersections, and they try to like pull from that, instead of just having a conversation.
So I the reason I'm also interested in that intersection and the way it plays out in terms of identity is, you know, I was raised by my Japanese grandfather, and I've always felt also a little bit on this intersection between my Japanese identity and my very American identity. And you know, it's one of the things that's come up sometimes for me is when people find out I'm Japanese, they say whatever Asian words they know. And I'm like, actually, I'm born and raised in the United States. I actually don't have all of those words. And it's interesting because in relation, if we bring it back to the traumatic response, I'm often baffled in that moment. I don't know how to respond, and I realize maybe about 4 hours later, 24 hours later, oh, I had a trauma response. I actually went into a total freeze in that moment. And so one of the things I think that perhaps people who live in various positions of privilege maybe don't realize is how often those small triggers get activated.
Correct.
In people who don't occupy that same privilege. And we all have different privileges, as you mentioned. You know, you have the educational privilege, being raised in the United States. There's gender privilege and, you know, race privilege and all other economic privilege, many other different types of privilege. And whenever you sit in that position, your occupying of that position almost necessarily has some traumatic effects on others. So here we are, we're waking up to this truth. What are we going to do about it? You know?
I think we shouldn't get stressed out by it, because again, like we were saying earlier, that then you'll be so paranoid that you're offending someone that you can't just be present and like have a real sincere moment with someone. But just also being mindful of the fact that we all have landmines. You know, we all have something that we're sensitive about, whether we want to own it or not, and that I would say that all of us have been traumatized. I know they say 70%, but all of us can say that something has happened in our lives.
Well, Spencer says we've all been born.
We have a shared trauma.
That birthday.
We've all been born. I mean,
We've all been on 95.
But I think if we're just trying to be our best versions of ourselves, and recognize that there are a lot of nuances and things going on, and that there's so much more beyond the peak of the iceberg going on, and just being mindful of that would just make our interactions with each other a lot better.
I really agree. Definitely agree. There's one last point about trauma that I would love for us to discuss, and this is something that often gets left out of trauma discussions, which is post-traumatic growth. How many of you, show of hands, have heard about post-traumatic growth? Not very many people, huh? So one of the things that studies show is that there are the vast majority of people who experience a traumatic event will, you know, level off in some version of normalcy, and then there are a large percentage that experience PTSD, and this is what we spend most time talking about. However, there are a few outliers that hit what's called post-traumatic growth, which means that their functionality in society and by social norms and their resolution, they process their trauma, they move into a space where that trauma has led them to grow and to reach new levels of realization. And this is something that the schools of positive psychology have really studied in order to figure out what makes someone experience something like this traumatic incident and then experience exponential growth So to such a degree that 10 years later they report more happiness, more joy, more success than they did before. So Hunter, you mentioned that, so perhaps you wanted to kind of dive into that a
I
little.
mean, it kind of goes back to the old adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So it also, there's an underlying point to be made that any given traumatic event is experienced differently by different people. So, the same thing might happen to me that happened to someone else, but I might experience it totally differently. I may or may not have the same traumatic response as that other person had, or they might or might not have the same one that I had. So there's a lot of variation and nuance in terms of that, and that also plays into how people later experience post-traumatic growth, or don't experience it. Maybe they veer towards post-traumatic growth and processing the experience that they've been through and finding meaning in it, or maybe they veer towards just getting stuck in a story.
One of the factors that I was reading about this was that the people who are most likely to experience post-traumatic stress or PTSD after an incident are those who experience helplessness, or somehow they were restricted in their ability to act. They were pinned down in some capacity. That feeling of helplessness almost always led to loss of agency, a feeling of powerlessness that created that classic Pavlovian response of not the dog salivating, but the learned helplessness of being stuck in the cage even though the cage door is open. So then, if we take that to flip the other way, in those moments of the stressful encounter, those individuals who weren't pinned down, that could act in some way, even if that action didn't lead to the result, but it was the seed of action somehow that gave a higher likelihood of post-traumatic growth after, which is interesting, I think, because again, it's that root of agency. I was able to do something, or I was not able to do anything. Do you have some experience with the post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, we see it a lot. We talk about it a lot because for a long time it got confused with resiliency. Because
What's the difference?
Okay, so resiliency, when you're working with someone who has trauma, if they have the traumatic event and they're resilient, they have that within them, they will usually bounce back. They'll have and they won't need to change their belief system, and they won't need, of course they're going to change, there's no doubt. But when someone is doing post-traumatic growth, they don't have the resiliency. So that is why I like how you pointed out, Tessa, it's either, there's like no middle ground. They will all of a sudden either get new meaning, new beliefs, new purpose in life, and they'll say, oh my God, I'm so glad that this happened. And people are puzzled by that, but they're able to see that this situation caused an intense growth and change in them, and they'll see it that way.
I can offer a really great example of that, a really profound one, and I'm teaching it in the class that I'm doing right now at the state prison. We're using Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
And
A show of hands, how many people have heard of Viktor Frankl?
And Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
So it starts with his describing his experiences of life in the concentration camp in Auschwitz and other camps that he was taken to. And he looks at why he felt that he and certain other people survived while other people didn't. And basically it doesn't, in his viewpoint, it doesn't come down to who had a little bit more soup, or who had a jacket or a blanket, or who didn't get assigned to that work detail that involved being outside in the freezing cold with no coat, laying train tracks or whatever. Of course, all those things came into play, but at the end of the day, it came down to one's attitude and how they responded to the situation in any given moment. And he said that powers beyond your control can take away everything you possess except for one thing, which is your ability to choose how you respond in any given moment. And I think that developing that capacity through mindfulness, through other things that develop self-awareness, helps us move towards post-traumatic growth. Because we gain more of an ability to see our triggers and respond, rather than experiencing our triggers and reacting. So this came up very vividly in one of the classes when someone shared that what had got him there, I asked for stories, examples of, when have you experienced something like this in your life where you had a moment where a button was pushed, a trigger came up, and you either acted or you stepped back and you had that moment of pause and you chose a reaction. And he shared about what got him in prison, which was, he was triggered by something and he described what it was and he killed somebody just in reaction. So now he's in there and he's experiencing the same thing in that context on a daily basis, the same triggers. But he's learning that he can choose how he responds to the triggers, and doesn't have to repeat that same obviously traumatizing experience for him, but fatal experience for someone else.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like where we are in terms of the yoga world right now is very much the same space. There have been actions that have been taken that have led to harm in some regards, and yet here we are with the tools that may potentially lead us to healing. So it is my great hope that our yoga world can experience post-traumatic growth, that we can use this pause that we're in right now to choose a new path forward. And I think that one of the things that's kind of scary about the yoga world right now is the uncertainty. Where's it going? That the known is no longer relevant in the same way, but that it's something that's forming in conversations like we're having now, in classrooms that are being taught from a different perspective, one with more inclusivity, with more sensitivity, with less emphasis on dominant cultures and more, more space for agency of all different types of people, students, teachers, facilitators. And I am just really, really grateful to each of you. So I just want to thank each of you for giving your time. Thank everyone who's come here this evening. So thank you so much, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope we all leave with a little bit of inspiration to make our practices and our classrooms, if we're teaching yoga, just that little bit more welcoming for ourselves and for everyone else. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So you'll see a pile of books behind me. I just brought a bunch of books from our trauma library at home in our bedroom. We usually bring them out when we do a trauma training, and I find that participants in our trainings find it really helpful to just see the literature about the subject and browse through it, pick up a book that appeals to you, and then maybe you get your own copy of it. So just feel free to browse through those. They're here after the panel.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. A little brain there. Thank you so much.